Hello, my name is Steve Galbraith, and I'm curator of the Cary Graphic Arts Collection at RIT, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the last of this year's Carry On series of occasional online programs. We appreciate and thank everyone who's joining us today, and as well as those who have joined us for our previous programs. I'm excited to say that our Carry On series will carry on into the new year. For example, on January 12th, we will host Yoda Bademacher, who will present on Tibetan typefaces. And on March 16th, we will be joined again by Robert Gordon-Fogelson, who will discuss his PhD research. Today we present a very special program that welcomes back 4 scholars who participated in the Cary Collection's Summer Research Fellowship Program. This program started back in 2014 in an effort to increase access to our collections for researchers who could benefit from focused study in our library. With initial funding from the Barnard Foundation, we put out our first call for applicants in the fall of 2014 and hosted our first research fellow in the summer of 2015. Our summer research fellowship was, and continues to be, open to scholars engaged with subject areas covered by our library's holdings. Indeed, one of the most exciting aspects of our 4 fellows who join us today is how they worked with such different areas in our collection: type specimens, bookbinding history, Hebrew typefaces, and mid-20th century design. The Cary Summer Fellowship supports this research by providing funding to cover a month's stay here in Rochester and at RIT. We understand, of course, that during these uncertain times, plans could change, but for now, we are dedicated to moving forward with this year's fellowship, and we're still very grateful that we were able to make the fellowship work this year. For those of you who are interested in applying for a summer research fellowship, the deadline is January 15th, 2021, and more information can be found in the link that we will provide in the chat. I know I speak for my colleagues when I say that we've been very, very pleased with how the fellowship program has gone so far. We've been especially excited to watch how the research that fellows conducted in our library has advanced into conference papers, journal articles, books, and even collaboration between fellows. We're also grateful for what we've learned about our collections from their expertise. In the next year or so, we hope to expand our fellowship program, so that's something I think we can all look forward to. I would like now to introduce each of our guests who will share their experiences as a Cary Research Fellow. After they've all presented, we'll then open things up for questions, and we ask that you post your questions into the chat. We begin today with Dori Griffin, our first fellow from 2015. Dori Griffin is an assistant professor at the University of Florida, where she teaches graphic design and design history in the School of Art and Art History. As the inaugural fellow in 2015, she began archival research for the book Type Specimens, A Visual History of Typesetting and Printing, forthcoming from Bloomsbury Academic Press. More than anything, Dori is passionate about co-designing equitable, inclusive, disciplinary literatures and studio classroom communities for designers of all social and cultural backgrounds. Jeff Peachy, who joined us in 2016. Jeff Peachy is an independent book conservator and toolmaker based in New York City. For more than 30 years, he has specialized in the conservation of books for institutions and individuals. He is a professional associate in the American Institute of Conservation, has taught book conservation workshops internationally, and has been awarded numerous fellowships to support his book History Research, including the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy and RIT's Cary Collection. He is a visiting instructor for the Library and Archives Conservation Education Consortium, LACE, at Buffalo State University, New York, and the Winthrop University of Delaware. His latest publication is titled Osbound, 1564, The History and Conservation of an Anabaptist Icon. Shani Avni, who joined us in 2017. Shani is the Ismar David Visiting Assistant Curator in the Cary Collection since 2020. She holds a BA in Graphic Design from Schenker College, Israel, and an MA in Typeface Design from the University of Reading, UK. For her MA thesis, she researched the David Hebrew typeface family, and since receiving her degree, continues to do so. Robert Gordon-Fogelson joined us this past fall in 2020. Robert is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History at the University of Southern California and a recipient of the Visual Studies Graduate Certificate. He works on 20th century design, architecture, and material culture with a focus on relationships between design and business, discourse and practice, and production and distribution. His dissertation, Total Integration, Design, Business, and Society in the United States, 1935 to 1985, examines the centrality of integration as a concept to mid-20th century design. Our guests today will present chronologically in the order of their fellowship year, and with that, we begin by welcoming back, virtually, to the Cary Collection, Dori Griffin.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here and to be talking with you today. And hopefully I am about to share some really lovely images from the Cary's wonderful collection with you. All right. So I'm going to try to move as quickly as possible, which is difficult because all of the images are so amazing. So when I wrote my my proposal in 2014, I was teaching typography and I was teaching design history at a public comprehensive university in southern Mississippi. And I wanted to do some interlinked projects with my students about the history of typography and the history of the type specimen. So since rural southern Mississippi isn't necessarily a hub for seeing typographic specimens live and in person, I headed to online archives, including but not limited to Google Images. And most of what I was able to find was very much centered around students doing type specimen projects for their beginning typography classes, which is wonderful, but it wasn't really what I was looking for. I was actually after this, right, which is a collection of contact sheets from what at the time was the Cary's largest ever image order. It might still be. I felt very greedy asking for reproductions of all of these amazing images that I found with much help from the wonderful curators at the Cary to illustrate typographic ideas and concepts for my students in the studio classroom. So when I arrived at the Cary, I was really interested in eventually writing and illustrating a book that makes the history of typographic practice accessible for practicing designers and for beginning design students. I had many conversations with fellow educators about this project. And one of the stories that sticks out for me the most is that I was talking with a fellow educator from a very large major metro area with quite a few fabulous and delightful typographic specimen collections located nearby their school. And they asked me why I would be interested in working on a project like this. Why didn't I just take my students to see the real thing? I would have loved to do that. But again, southern Mississippi is not really a hub for printing history. So I was interested in compiling a book that walks practitioners and future practitioners through the history of typography in a way that provides them with some context and some exposure to very famous moments in typographic history, but also access to less famous moments as well. And I definitely thank Emilia a million times over, including in the introduction of the book, for introducing me to the Cary's collection in such a really sensible and comprehensible and comprehensive way. So while I was at the Cary, I got to see documents that had been part of my own undergraduate design education. William Caslan's famous 1734 broadside specimen advertising the typefaces that he cut in London, England. Printers' manuals, something that I knew very little about before arriving at the Cary, but learned so much about. This one, for example, published serially between 1683 and 5, and then published as a single volume book by Joseph Moxon again in London. The first printer's manual explaining the printing trade for other printers ever published in any language. Encountered many foundry specimen books, like this one from 1742 in France. Spent a lot of time poring over hot metal type specimen books like this 1915 linotype specimen book, which came with its own announcement, somewhat like the birth of a baby. So the book itself is quite hefty and thick, and the announcement is quite slender and thin, although they are both oversized books. And just like a birth announcement, the announcement of the specimen book of type styles shared the weight of the specimen. And then possibly my favorite experience looking at specimen ephemera from various foundries. This particular example happens to be the first squared off sans serif face available in both upper and lower case from Nebbiolo in Italy. And then I had a few quasi-religious experiences with the beautiful items in the collection that, again, I am so beyond excited to share with my students and the students of my colleagues and all of the other teachers like me who are teaching type and type history in places that are far removed geographically from where they are teaching. So this is the 1874 William page chromatic, kind of the high point of polychromatic wood type printing in the United States. A Hamilton specimen book, which again is quite large, and I really enjoyed looking at. And then another moment from my own undergraduate education, Adrian Frutiger and Maximilian Vox's specimens for their original release of Universe in case, matrix, and film. And this eventually led me to the question, I encountered so many amazing and wonderful things in the Cary. What didn't I encounter? And I have found that my time physically in the archives at the Cary has really allowed me to locate other resources and understand what I'm seeing when I see them, so that I can expand the narrative that I am constructing, again, mostly for my own students, really, in my heart, so that they can situate typographic practice in a global context in many different ways. This example happens to be from Japan, but there are so many others that I have been able to include based on the foundation that I laid out while I was at the Cary. I would love to be in touch with you. Absolutely email me. I believe I'm probably way out of time. So thank you.
Thank you, Dori. Hand things over to Jeff Peachy.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm only going to talk about one book, even though I looked at tons of them, and it's kind of Dori mentioned a quasi-religious experience being there, and mine's kind of a personal love affair, I guess. And I'm just going to show a few things from a separate overhead camera here. All right. So the particular book I'm going to talk about is Edward Walker's The Art of Bookbinding, 1850. The original book is very rare. This is just an image of it. There's a whole book about this book, and Cary holds an obscene 3 copies of it. Some consider it the first American published description of bookbinding, but like much 19th century work, the book is largely copied from other sources, which has been well documented by Paul Coda. Todd Pattison, a conservator and book historian, aptly calls the cover the largest binder's signature ever. Even by 19th century standards, the borrowing of material was egregious. For example, Walker claims this is his New York book bindery, but it's actually a picture of Wesley and Clark's bindery from England from 8 years before. Binding historian Sarah Prideaux tended to regard the whole book as an advertisement, which it essentially is, but his intended audience were his clients. It does contain some useful information, though, but really who owned, not this book, but the copy in the Cary, who owned the book and commented on it is what really took my breath away. The copy number 1 is from the Bernard C. Middleton bookbinding collection, which the Cary modestly claims is one of the best collections concerning the history of bookbinding in the world. I might claim it's the best. Middleton was a major 20th century bookbinder and historian. His History of English Craft Bookbinding Technique is still a standard reference in the 4th revised edition. His practical manual, The Restoration of Leather Bindings, likely inspired many of us to enter this profession with the sexy cover image of his elegant hands at work on the spine of a book. He was both a practitioner and a scholar. This is the image of the paste down from the book. Couple things of interest here. First, we see Middleton's book plate here in the center. There's an inscription at the top, "To my dear sister, Miss Green," and it's the initials are E.W., which I think is Edward Walker, the author of the book. There's also a pencil inscription here, which I think is the Oak Knoll BM385 identification mark. They brokered the sale to the Cary in the year 2000 or a little earlier, and I went to the conference at Bookbinding 2000 there. On the flyleaf, we have the ownership mark of John Carter, 1936, and some partially erased pencil marks. A lot of clients come to me and they talk about this book or that book and who owned it, and a lot of it leaves me cold. But seeing John Carter's signature on this book really got me excited because he was a book historian, and he's well known for his ABC for book collectors, which is in the 9th edition now. So it's kind of a really fun read through defining bibliographic terms, including the term association copy, which he is defining, and the Walker book is an association copy. He was also one of the early researchers of cloth case bindings, which previously a lot of researchers looked at medieval manuscripts and earlier type books. He really brought things into the 19th century. Here are some of the earliest cloth case bindings from his book, and here are these Pickering bindings that I have. People are always amazed how small they are, but these were the first publisher's cloth bindings in the world, really. So they're important little things. But the real kicker for me is there's a letter. You probably can't read it, but reproduction of the letter tipped onto the flyleaf. And in it, Douglas Leighton, who was another 20th century bookbinding historian and bookbinder, talks to Carter, and he mentions that he spent a long night with it. And one thing really of interest was the term muslin for fabric for early book terms, which was unfamiliar. So when I read this letter, I suddenly had the self-awareness of a teenager on a first date. Like, wow, here I am holding the actual book that Walker, Middleton, Carter, and Leighton held and read. It was thrilling. And at the same time, it was difficult for me to believe how thrilled I was to be in close contact with these book historian rock stars. So one reproduction results from this as well. And Finally, just yesterday as I was preparing this talk, I reread the epigraph at the beginning of Walker's book. In some ways, it purposely encapsulated my own experience. I quote, "How I love books, not only for their imaginative pleasures they afford me, but for making me love to be in contact with them. The contact, the association with previous owners on this copy of Walker's book binding was a surprising, irrational thrill for me, a reminder of the intangible aspects and unique qualities of even 19th century printed book." Thanks, Cary.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. Thank
Yeah,
you for your kind words about the Middleton collection.
it's awesome.
All right, and next up we have Shani Avni.
Hello. So my journey started at the University of Reading in the UK in 2015 when I was undergoing the MA Typeface Design program. And what appealed to me about this program is that it is research intensive. It relies on the idea that typeface design does not exist in a void, and it is never isolated from its context. So a lot of our time was invested in learning various aspects of type design in order to gain historical, cultural, and technical understanding, in addition to the design skills. And the MA program consists of a practical design of a typeface and an academic dissertation. For my dissertation, I chose to research a groundbreaking Hebrew typeface that was designed by Ismar David. It is called David Hebrew, and it was conceived in the 1930s. And this is the first multi-style and multi-weight Hebrew typeface family. The Cary holds the Ismar David archival collection, and so I reached out and expressed my interest. Ismar David was a prolific calligrapher, type designer, graphic and architectural designer, illustrator, and educator. And from the 1930s until the 1990s, he lived and worked in Berlin, Jerusalem, and New York. And he created a variety of exquisite designs. His most important work is considered to be the David Hebrew typeface family, which I was about to start researching. I was looking for original drawings, annotated proofs, personal and professional correspondence, and any other document that shed more light on the innovative vision of creating and producing the David Hebrew typeface family. And Ismar David was a very prolific designer, and his archive is very large. And having no prior experience of working with archives, I don't think I really understood the scope of David's archive when I asked for a lot of items to be digitized and emailed to me for my research. And I think I can relate to what Dori said, this sense of greediness, of just wanting, to see it all and to be able to work with all of this material. And I could just share that now that I truly understand the efforts that the Cary made to accommodate me, I'm even more grateful for the Cary and for Emilia. Now, I'm even more grateful now that at the time that I was, since my entire research was dependent on those files at the time. So after my graduation, it was very clear to me that the research that I did for my dissertation was just the tip of the iceberg, and that there was so much more to learn from the David archive. And I was thrilled to be chosen as the Cary Fellow for 1917. Before I arrived, I wished to find answers to these questions. What was the ink drawing? What can, the ink drawing reveal about David's design process? And again, the possibility to physically hold and interact and examine those original drawings was very important for me, something that I couldn't just do with a digital file. I was interested to know what were David's references and sources of inspiration for his work, and could they be applied to students of type design today? I was wondering, how did David approach his multi-script designs, and could designer learn from it and apply this approach to current typographic multi-script practices? And I'm very happy to share with you that I found many, many answers to those questions. But what was even more exciting for me was what I was able to discover that I never anticipated, all those new things that I learned from being able to go through the entire archive and examine it. these things led me on new research paths that I could never even imagined. For example, I had the rare opportunity of printing with the original Hebrew metal type, which again gave me this very teenagery excitement, just like Dori and Jeff described, but also was very educational for me as far as type design goes. I think I learned so much from being able to handset and letterpress Hebrew type that no experience could be really similar to that one. I gave a talk that was inspired by boxes of greeting cards that David designed during his prolific career, and that gave me a different insight to his work and through how it developed annually. And I published an article based on David's never seen before Hebrew currency designs. And this article was published in the Visible Language Journal, the special issue on the history of visual communication design that was edited by Dori, that is here. And it was an absolute pleasure to work with. And that special issue also won the 2019 Design Incubation Communication Design Educators Award. So for me, this was such a unique research opportunity, and it truly opened so many new doors for me. I strongly recommend it, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you, Cary.
Thank you so much. And with that, we conclude this part with Robert. Robert, didn't seem like it was that long ago when I would have seen you in person.
Yes, yeah. So I was just at the Cary in September and October in the midst of the pandemic. So I am particularly grateful to all of the staff there for making me feel welcome and safe as well, and for helping me to conduct my research there. So let's see. So as Steve mentioned, I was at the Cary conducting research for my dissertation in art history, which is titled Total Integration, Design, Business, and Society in the United States from 1935 to 1985. And so this project, I'm concerned with the idea of integration primarily as an economic and a visual ideal. It was a sort of multifaceted term used in many ways throughout the 20th century. But I'm really interested in those kinds of valences, which I think you can see here in this advertisement for Container Corporation of America, which shows these sort of tiers of packaging production, you know, from raw material all the way to the finished paperboard package. But also Cassandra, the French designer who created this, is sort of translating this economic ideal into visual form here, compositionally, through this sort of tiering of factories, but also graphically and typographically, right? You can see this, the word integration itself on the left-hand side. So this is a sort of snapshot of the dissertation. And so I applied for a Cary Fellowship actually because I had been to the Cary 2 summers ago, very briefly. I was at the Vignelli Center just across campus looking at material for one of my chapters, and popped into the Cary for a little bit that summer and realized there was sort of an enormous amount of material related to corporate design, in particular, for my interest, in the graphic design archives, and that this could really enrich my dissertation as a whole. So I was very excited to return this fall to delve much more deeply into these collections. And one of the many things I was looking at was this exhibition by Will Burton, a 1948 exhibition that Will Burton organized at New York's AD Gallery in 1948, from 1948 to 1949, which was titled Integration, the New Discipline in Design. And so very pertinent to my sort of research. And it was kind of a manifesto that explained, in which Burton explained the concept of integrated design as a sort of way to combine text and image, but also different media, in order to sort of better organize our visual experience of the environment. And one of the great things about the Burton papers is how comprehensive they are. So in addition to the sort of pages of notes for a book on this subject that was never published, you also have things like this amazing set of blueprints, which show how the exhibition itself was organized to communicate this idea of visual integration. So viewers sort of bounced back and forth from wall to wall, combining the sort of individual principles of integration or graphic design into a sort of integrated concept at the center. And one of the things that I think is so exciting about the Cary is that it's constantly growing and expanding and enhancing its collection. So in addition to the Burton papers, I was also looking at the Tomoko Miho collection. And so while Burton has been there, the Burton papers have been there for a long time and are incredibly well organized. The Miho collection is recent, relatively recent, and still being processed. So these are just some of the things I was looking at there, some more advertisements for Container Corporation of America, and also this sort of packaging system, a graphic visualization to show how its packaging system worked. And so this collection offered sort of surprising discoveries. For me, these were materials that I had never seen before. So I think I'll end there, but just a note that the outcome for me of this research is still to come. I'm still processing all of this and writing it up as my dissertation, which I'm hoping to finish in the next year or so. But as Steve mentioned, I'll be back at the Cary virtually in the spring, giving a talk on some of this material more in depth. So I do hope to see some of you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. You brought up your use of the Miho archive, and I just wanted to add that that's a great example of the kind of reciprocal benefit, having a researcher come in and engage in a relatively new archive, and that gives the curators and archivists in Cary, reason to be engaged with it, and so this is something we're very thankful for. The learning experiences that we have by having research fellows in Cary. I also thought during all your wonderful presentations, which I found so very inspiring, that I was reminded that really one of the when I think of the goals of the fellowship, one of the goals I think about is being able to have a researcher in at just that right time in their project where we can be a nice gust of wind at the sails, as it were, and maybe help them towards a goal. And it seemed, that might have been the case here, and that makes me very, very happy from the Cary point of view. I think a few of you mentioned this. One of the questions I had about sort of favorite items or inspiring moments that you had. I think you've given some examples already, which is wonderful. And Shani, you gave an example of maybe an item that may have turned your research in a new direction. But do any of you want to comment on perhaps a particular item or collection that really had an impact on your research?
I could share unexpectedly that I spent a lot of time what I thought was cheating, kind of browsing through house organs and magazines by various linotype, monotype, etc. And I loved browsing through them just for the sake of encountering mostly the advertisements in those publications. And again, at the time, it felt like I was stealing time away from what I should have been doing. But at the moment, I am engaged in pulling together a visual glossary, basically a series of visual footnotes for beginning design students so that they can understand antiquated terms that are beyond their everyday practice. And I find myself drawing on my memories of all of those periodicals that I looked at simply for the sake of how beautiful and fascinating they were and how happy I was to be turning their pages. So that has turned into an experience that has a bit unexpectedly informed a lot of the ongoing work for this project.
Oh, thank you. That's a wonderful example. Any other comments from the participants?
I can maybe also add that I learned a lot about people that I only knew by name or didn't know of at all that Ismar David worked with, collaborated with, or even had within his network. And I was able to discover so much information from, again, very different areas and geographical places, again, the three places that he worked in. And at some point, that kind of made me feel that these are complete professionals that I would like to research, their work and life by themselves, without having, not only the relationship with David. So, and that list just grew and grew as I was able to go through all the correspondence, for example.
I remember one of those moments, Shani, when I think it was about Doc Leslie.
Exactly.
Made this wonderful connection, but then started telling us about his legacy in Israel, which we hadn't known about. That was a very lovely moment.
I remember that I was so touched by how many things he has done for print and for typography in Israel. I think I felt like, and I shared this with you, that we should have a street named after him in Israel, and yet nobody knows his name. It was a really strong feeling to discover so much about him. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And we do have a question in the chat, and this is would be a good one for Emilia. Is there a working print studio that can be accessed and used as a companion piece to research?
Sure. Hi, I'm Emilia Fontanel. I'm the associate curator at the Cary, and I'm the manager of our letterpress print studio, our technology collection. And yes, the answer is yes. So there are 30 working printing presses and thousands of metal and about 600 of wood typefaces and all the accoutrements for printing. So that is an area that is listed as one of the areas of specialty in the fellowship page there. So we haven't had a fellow yet who wants to really work on letterpress printing, but we would welcome that.
Also, I think, Emilia, we've done in the past, and we should consider looking forward when we've had artists in residence. And that might be something that you might see more of in the Cary future, because we've had some nice experiences in the past decade with that.
Absolutely. And just to piggyback on your first question there, Steve, about our fellows being inspired, I'd just like to say that every time we have a new fellow come visit us in the Cary collection, we learn about our own collection in ways that then goes on to serve future patrons. So I can imagine, the one that sticks out in my mind is when I had an extended long conversation with Jeff about how there's metal armatures in paper mache bindings, and I was absolutely blown away. And he had a magnet, and he's like, look, the magnet's catching. So that tells me a lot more about these objects that are in our care. So that's a huge moment so that we can preserve them. So thank you to all of you.
And I think for any of the folks attending this talk, we're looking at this from the library point of view rather than being a research fellow. I think that's really one of the great benefits of offering a research fellowship program, is the way that it reveals more and more about your own collection, something we've been particularly grateful for. Do any of the past fellows have any research tips for future Cary fellows, or maybe some advice to give?
I can think of a few.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Shani.
I know that I remember remembering these tips when I was doing my MA and not really familiar with working in archives. And I kind of I wrote them down and I memorized them, and I only realized how important they were once I had to confront with so much material during such short period of time. So I think that the system that you devise for yourself with your own preferences of documenting what you see, and maybe documenting them as much as you can while you are engaging with the articles, so you would be able to then go home and process them. If you're taking pictures, always take the picture of the item with the number of the folder and the box and where it is located in the archive itself physically, because if you would want to go back and look for that or ask a curator to look at it for you, you will need to know exactly what it is. And the larger the collection is, the more complicated it is. Super, super important, and very devastating when you have one thing and you have no idea where it was or where you can find it again. And I know that I love to work with tables and with thumbnails of the images, and then being able to, so I would create just a table with a thumbnail of the image, where it's located, and then the information that I already have, and then my notes and my thoughts and things that I know that I would want to elaborate on later on. And I remember that my days when I was in the Cary were like definitely, a 2-shift day. So from 9 to 5, I was with the artifact, taking pictures, kind of knowing that I can, I'd be sure to visit everything later on. And then when I would go back, so that was like from 6 to midnight or whatever, I would revisit everything and kind of start to strategize about how I'm going to process it and to what end. So it's like two different things that needs to be kind of well built within your own system, if it makes any sense.
Sure, that's very good advice. Anything else from at least Robert?
Yeah, I guess building on that, I had two sort of very different experiences between my sort of very brief visit and then my follow-up, the fellowship period, which was that, and this I think is one of the sort of really valuable things about a whole month of focused research in a collection, is that I was able to spend a lot more time, taking notes, processing, sort of mentally what I was looking at as I was there. Just this past fall, as opposed to when I was there very briefly in the summer, when there's, I think all researchers know what I'm talking about when I say there's a sense that you have to look at everything there is to look at as quickly and sort of efficiently as possible. So the ability to really slow down, look closely, take notes, spend time with these materials is a sort of incredibly valuable, I think, experience.
Oh, thank you, Robert. Any other comments? And Dori?
Yeah, so for me, one of the really fabulous things about being in the collection for an entire month in person was that browsing physically is very different from browsing digitally, and I'm okay with both. I love doing both, but they're different experiences. And so having the time in the collection to make the sorts of random discoveries that one makes inside a physical archive rather than a digital archive was just so valuable and exciting.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that a little bit. I totally understand what you meant when you said about cheating, in terms of just kind of expanding the scope of where you're looking. But for me, one of the great things about being in an archive is that there are other people there, and you can look with other people. And sometimes it's so amazing how much more you can see just when you have somebody else talking about what you're looking at the same time. And it's not just such an isolating experience that you feel is, only going to manifest itself in more print down the road, but there's something immediate and personal, and I think something that can really be gained by having, the expertise of the Cary librarians and curators there too. So that's something I really enjoyed, was looking with people, looking at things with people.
Thank you, Jeff. And of course, we've shared the same experience back. And it's something I think about too, is if we expanded the program to have more fellowships, if people could be there at the same time and have a kind of more community dialogue, even in unrelated fields, you get a lot out of just these kind of scholarly conversations. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Jeff. I think what would be fun as we're wrapping up the kind of question and answer is if any of the fellows had questions for each other.
I was just going to say, I get in touch with Shani all the time and ask her questions. It's wonderful to have a community.
Dori, if any of her cheating actually led to other new discoveries or coming around to what you originally intended to.
So most of it has fed back into this particular project, but I wrote, oddly and quite unrelatedly, an encyclopedia entry for the University of Chicago Press History of Cartography encyclopedia series, and I spec'd an image from a type specimen book that was 19th century schoolboys studying geography in a one-room schoolhouse around a globe as an illustration for that encyclopedia entry. So random snippets have made their way into other projects.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I have to say, when you first started your talk, Dorian, you had that contact sheet image. And I know that was just a small amount of what you what you had looked at in the Cary, but it was exciting for me to see that whole screen full of images in Cary that might have been helpful for you. And I wonder about Dori just wrote you about 25 pages of those sheets. That's amazing. Before we begin to wrap up, I just wanted to see if any of the my Cary colleagues might have a question. Emilia, do you have anything to ask or maybe to add about your experiences with the program?
I think that you asked Steve about what would be helpful for researchers to come to Cary. And I think one of the first questions, and I saw it was one of the first questions today in the chat, was, is everything digitized? And how can I get pictures of it? And so that's a question that we answer all the time. I'm sorry, it's not asking a question of my friends, the fellows, but I would like to advise people who are interested in research that there's a way to request that kind of thing, and it's absolutely doable. And there's a research image request on our website there, and I'll put that in the chat. That's a huge question, and we do digitization of our items. So, and I think I've talked to every single one of our fellows about having items photographed. And thank you for the shout out, Dori, for our department doing all that digitization for you.
And I just think along those lines, Emilia, in addition to our own digitization, what we do here in the Cary collection, RIT Libraries, I know we're joined by some of our colleagues in RIT Libraries, have been growing our digitization lab. So our digital capabilities will only increase moving forward. So I think that's a very exciting way to get further access to our collections. But as several of you have really said today, being here and being able to browse and to have interactions with curators and other scholars, it does create a kind of context rather than just simply access, and I think that context is very, very important for researchers. I mean, I'm just very happy to say that, first of all, I'm very glad to see everybody in the same sort of space again, if only virtually. And, I think just even, hearing more about your experiences today has inspired me, as I'm sure it's inspired Emilia and Shani to really, really keep forging ahead with this program and try to expand it and to continue to make it even more dynamic. So I really, really appreciate you joining us today and appreciate the work that you did here in Cary and you continue to do with your research. So thank you so much.